Okay, so you're back for another deep dive. Great to have you along for this one. You know, as a philosopher, you're probably always on the lookout for those powerful analytical tools, the kind that help you unpack complex ideas. And today, we've got one that might just fit the bill. We're going to be taking a look at situation semantics.
Now, I know you're already well-versed in the world of possible world semantics. It's kind of a mainstay in contemporary philosophy of language.
For sure.
Right. So think of situation semantics as being in the same family, but with a bit of a twist. Instead of evaluating truth against these vast, complete hypothetical worlds, it zooms in on smaller, more localized pieces of reality. We call these situations.
Right, so it's getting down to the nitty-gritty, the specifics.
Exactly. And like a lot of those big philosophical concepts, think about the ongoing debates about possible worlds themselves, or even the very nature of events. Well, the exact nature of a situation in situation semantics is still a topic of active discussion. Some folks see them as these structured collections of individuals and relations, while others view them as more fundamental entities in their own right.
So we're already wading into some deep philosophical waters here.
We are. But the real beauty of this framework, regardless of those foundational debates, is its focus on partiality. This focus opens up some truly novel ways to analyze all the nuances of how we actually use language.
Awesome. And for this deep dive, we've gone straight to the source, diving into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on situation semantics. Think of it as your curated guide to this fascinating theory.
Absolutely.
And we're not just going to skim the surface here, we're going deep, aiming to understand the real analytical power of situation semantics, particularly in those areas where it offers unique insights that you might not find in other semantic theories.
We'll be exploring things like implicit quantifier restrictions, how those tricky donkey pronouns actually work, and even how we arrive at those exhaustive interpretations of questions.
It's going to be quite the journey. So are you ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
Okay. So where do we even begin with situation semantics? I know it has its roots in the analysis of perception.
You got it. The story kind of starts with John Barwise and his groundbreaking work on what we call direct perception reports.
Okay, so we're talking about sentences like, Beryl saw Meryl feed the animals.
Exactly. And it's important to distinguish those from indirect perception reports like Beryl saw that Meryl fed the animals. Both imply that, the feeding actually happened, but there's a subtle but crucial difference in how we understand the embedded clause, that little sentence within the bigger sentence.
Right, the Meryl feed the animals part. And I remember this idea of transparency. It plays a key role, right?
It does. So imagine we have a sentence like, Beryl saw Meryl sprinkle the white powder on Cheryl's dinner. And let's say, just for the sake of argument, that this white powder turns out to be, the most lethal poison. Now, intuitively, it feels like we can validly infer from that first sentence that Beryl saw Meryl sprinkle the most lethal poison on Cheryl's dinner.
Yeah, that definitely seems like a fair inference to make.
Right. It's like we can see right through that embedded clause, Meryl sprinkled the white powder. But now, contrast that with the indirect report. Beryl saw that Meryl sprinkled the white powder on Cheryl's dinner. Even if the powder was indeed poison, we can't automatically conclude that Beryl actually saw that Meryl sprinkled poison. Maybe she didn't recognize it as poison.
Oh, I see. So that little word "that" kind of creates a barrier, a sort of opacity.
Exactly. So Barwise's big question was, what's going on under the hood? What's the mechanism that accounts for this transparency, specifically in these direct perception reports?
And his initial answer was all about situations, right?
It was. He proposed that these direct reports are essentially asserting the existence of a real, concrete situation, an actual event that Beryl witnessed, in which that embedded clause, Meryl feed the animals, is true. So the verb see isn't directly taking a proposition like a set of possible worlds as its object, but rather this specific slice of reality, this situation.
Ah, so instead of saying Beryl saw a certain fact or truth, we're saying she saw a particular concrete situation unfold.
That's a great way to put it. And here's where it gets really interesting from a philosophical point of view. If C is selecting situations instead of sets of possible worlds, then it provides a very elegant explanation for why we can substitute different descriptions without changing the truth of the whole sentence, as long as those descriptions refer to the same event in reality.
Okay, walk me through that.
Let's stick with our example. Say Meryl fed the animals only once. And on that occasion, she fed them, hay. The situations where Meryl feed the animals is true are going to be the exact same situations where Meryl feed the animals hay is true.
Yeah, makes sense.
So Barwise's analysis correctly predicts that those two sentences, barrel saw Merrill feed the animals and barrel saw Merrill feed the animals hay would have the same truth value in that scenario.
Interesting. But I guess not everyone jumped on board with this whole situations idea right away.
You're absolutely right. It wouldn't be philosophy if everyone just agreed.
Right.
There were some pretty prominent voices arguing that we could achieve the same results with Davidsonian event semantics without needing to bring in these new entities called situations.
Right, Davidsonian
Yeah,
semantics.
that's the theory where verbs implicitly involve an event argument. And the critique was that, hey, maybe perception verbs like see are just like other verbs that establish a relation between, say, an agent and an event.
So instead of saying Beryl saw a situation, we could say she saw a particular feeding event.
Exactly. And this debate really set the stage for a lot of the development of situation semantics, which often proceeded in dialogue with and sometimes in opposition to these event-based approaches. But we'll definitely circle back to the relationship between these frameworks a bit later.
Sounds good. So the concept of situations emerges, at least in part, from thinking about what we see about perception. But it didn't stay confined to that realm, did it?
Not at all. Situation semantics grew into a much broader theory of information content, and the key players here are infons, sometimes also called states of affairs.
Okay, impounds, got it.
Think of these as the basic, fundamental building blocks of information, like the atoms of meaning.
Cool.
They consist of a relation, the individuals involved in that relation, and what we call a polarity, which tells you whether the relation holds or not.
Okay, so for example, Nina bothering Stella would be an infin with the relation bothering, the individuals Nina and Stella, and a positive polarity. And if we wanted to express Nina not bothering Stella, we just switch that polarity to negative.
You got it. That's exactly how it works. It's like a simple, logical representation of a basic fact.
It does sound a bit like those atomic facts that philosophers love to talk about.
It's a good analogy. But infos can get a bit more complex than that. For instance, we have these things called parameterized states of affairs, where some of the roles in the relation aren't filled in yet. It's like having a placeholder, like an X, in the info. So you might have something like bothering X, Stella, no, where X is this unspecified individual.
So it's like saying someone is not bothering Stella without specifying who that someone is.
Exactly. And these parameters can then be anchored to specific individuals. So if we anchor X to Nina, we get back to our original info, Nina not bothering Stella.
Ah, so we're filling in the blanks. And I'm guessing we can build even more complex structures from these basic infos.
You bet. There are ways to combine these basic units. And importantly, there's this concept of parameter absorption, which is kind of like lambda abstraction in formal semantics. It lets us derive properties and relations from these parameterized states of affairs.
Okay, I'm following so far.
So from our example of bothering X, Stella, no, we can abstract over X to get the property of not bothering Stella. And the goal here was really ambitious. The idea was to develop a theory of information that applies not just to language, but to a whole bunch of phenomena, how frogs process information, visual perception, databases, even cognitive science.
Wow, so they were aiming for a truly unified theory of information. That's a pretty big philosophical undertaking. What was the main motivation behind all of this?
Well, a big part of it was a challenge that folks were grappling with in possible worlds semantics.
Right, that was the dominant framework at the time.
Exactly. And the problem was that in that framework, propositions are basically defined as sets of possible worlds where they're true. So if two propositions are true in all the same possible worlds, they're considered identical. This leads to some weird consequences, especially when you're talking about beliefs. It would mean that if you believe one proposition, you automatically believe every other proposition that happens to be true in all the same worlds, even if they're expressed in wildly different ways.
Yeah, that doesn't seem right. It's like saying if I believe all bachelors are unmarried, I must also believe that, say, the square root of 9 is an odd number. Those are both true statements, but believing one doesn't automatically mean you believe the other.
Right. That's the classic problem of logical omissions. So situation semantics, with its more fine-grained infons, was seen as a potential solution. The idea was that it could give us a more nuanced account of information content, one that could avoid these counterintuitive consequences.
So instead of lumping all logically equivalent propositions together, we're recognizing that there are subtle differences in what information they convey.
Exactly. But of course, there were other contenders for the crown, like theories of structured propositions.
Right, those also tried to distinguish logically equivalent propositions by looking at their internal structure.
Exactly. And this debate is still going on today. It often comes down to some pretty fundamental disagreements about, possible entities, properties, relations, all that good stuff. But I think it's important to note that even though this broader theory of information content is a big part of situation semantics, the framework has also been incredibly useful for analyzing more specific things in language, things that don't necessarily require those super detailed infos.
Okay, so even if we don't go all in on informs as the be-all and end-all of information, situation semantics still has a lot to offer.
Absolutely. And one of those areas where it really shines is in understanding Austinian topic situations. This is where we start to see how situation semantics connects with the philosophy of language in a really powerful way.
Austin. Not the city, but the
Exactly.
philosopher.
Right. J.L. Austin, famous for his work on speech acts, he made this really important point that utterances are typically about specific situations. The whole world is just a kind of limiting case.
So it's not just about what we're saying, but what we're saying it about.
Exactly. And Barwise and Etchemendy gave this great example to illustrate this. Claire has the three of clubs. Now, whether that's true or not depends completely on which card game we're talking about, which situation. Imagine two games going on at the same time. Claire in one but not the other. The statement could be true relative to one situation and false relative to the other.
Right, the context matters.
It's crucial. And if our statements are about specific situations, then when we report those statements, we need to take those situations into account to be accurate. And this has really important implications for how we understand belief ascriptions, statements about what people believe.
Because our beliefs are also often directed towards specific situations.
Exactly. And there's this really interesting example involving a butler and a judge that illustrates this perfectly.
Ooh, a story.
It's a good one. So this judge was having money problems and confided in his butler. The butler started to suspect that a guy named Milford was helping the judge out financially. Then, while the butler was away, the judge had an accident and was rescued by a stranger. When the butler got back, he overheard folks talking about the stranger, and someone mentioned the name Milford. The butler, thinking they were still talking about the money situation, said, "Oh yeah, I suspected Milford all along." Later, someone said, "The butler suspects that Milford saved the judge."
But that doesn't really feel right, does it? Even though technically the butler did suspect Milford of something.
Exactly. It's misleading, maybe even false, because the situation everyone else was talking about was the accident, not the money troubles. The butler had no beliefs about Milford and the accident. So this shows us that our belief ascriptions aren't just about the content of the belief, they're also about the situation that belief is directed towards. Yeah. It's not just what you believe, it's what you believe about a specific situation.
Makes sense. And are these Austinian topic situations always explicitly stated, or are they often implicit?
They're often implicit, hiding in the background. But sometimes we get clues from the language itself, like from tense.
Tense, like past, present, future.
Exactly. There's this example with a witness describing a book. They say, there was a book on the table. It was in Russian. Notice that both sentences are in the past tense, even though the book presumably is still in Russian. It would sound weird to say it is in Russian.
Yeah, it would. Why is that?
It's because the first sentence sets up a past topic situation, the scene that the witness saw. And the tense in the second sentence is anchored to that past situation, even though the property of being in Russian is still true now. It's like we're still talking about that past situation.
Ah, so tense helps us keep track of which situation we're talking about. That's pretty cool. And this whole idea of topic situations, it helps us understand those implicit quantifier restrictions, right?
Absolutely. Barwise and Perry were really onto something here. They argued that the Austinian perspective could explain how we implicitly restrict the domains of our quantifiers.
You mean like when I say everyone is asleep, and I don't literally mean everyone in the entire universe.
Exactly. Like imagine you're in a room where some people are asleep and some are awake. If you say no one is sleeping, is that true? It depends on what situation you're referring to. If you mean no one in the whole world, it's probably false. But if you're just talking about the people in that room, it could be true.
Right, so it's like there's an unspoken in this room attached to that no one.
Exactly. The truth depends on which situation you're talking about. And Barwise and Perry use the example of a sleep lab, where the speaker is obviously only talking about the research assistants in the lab, so no one is asleep can be perfectly true, even if there are tons of people sleeping elsewhere.
Ah, so the context, the situation, helps us figure out what the speaker really means. And this also applies to those incomplete, definite descriptions, right? Like when someone says, I am the cook.
Perfect example. If someone asks, who made all this amazing food? and you say, I am the cook, that could be misleading if you only made one dish. But if someone compliments your cheesecake and asks who made that, then I, the cook, is perfectly fine.
Because in that case, the situation is just the cheesecake, not the entire meal.
Precisely. The Austinian perspective says that all our assertions are about some specific situation, and that situation might only be a part of the bigger picture.
This all seems very intuitive and elegant. But did this approach face any pushback?
Oh, of course. There were definitely some influential critiques, especially from Soames. He argued that this whole partiality thing doesn't necessarily make things simpler.
Oh,
One of his concerns was about attributive readings of definite descriptions. Imagine you see a bear in the distance. You might say the bear might be a grizzly. Now, you're not saying that that specific bear, let's call him Bruno, has the potential to be a grizzly. You're saying that whatever bear is there, based on your current knowledge, it could be a grizzly.
right. It's about the possibility of any bear in that situation being a grizzly, not just Bruno himself.
Exactly. And Soames argued that the Austinian topic situation, just the bear sighting situation itself, couldn't provide the right restriction here. It seemed like we needed domain restrictions to be more like properties, not just situations.
That makes sense. The situation tells us which bear, but the attributive reading is about the potential of any bear in that situation.
Exactly. But proponents of possibilistic situation semantics, which combines situations with possible worlds, argued that they could handle this. They said, look, the statement is about the bear sighting situation, but to figure out what might means, we need to consider epistemic alternatives to that situation.
Epistemic alternatives, meaning?
Meaning other possible situations that are consistent with what we know. And these alternatives are also partial, and they also contain a bear. So the domain of bear is restricted within those possible situations that are related to our original topic situation.
Oh, so we're branching out from the original situation to consider other possibilities, and the restriction applies within those possibilities.
That's the idea. But Soames had another objection. He pointed out that some restrictions don't seem to come from topic situations at all.
Okay, like,
He used the example, everyone is asleep and is being monitored by a research assistant. Now, if all restrictions came from a single topic situation, this would mean the assistants are also asleep, which is obviously not what we mean.
right, the sleepers and the assistants are two separate groups.
Exactly. Soames argued that this showed that topic situations couldn't account for all restrictions. But proponents of situation semantics argued back, saying, hey, we never said that all restrictions come from a single topic situation.
Okay.
They introduced the idea of resource situations, which can provide the domains for different parts of a sentence.
So we might have one situation for the sleepers and a different one for the assistants.
Exactly. And in possibilistic situation semantics, different predicates in the same sentence can be evaluated relative to different situations. The sentence as a whole then expresses a relationship between those situations.
So it's like a network of interconnected situations.
Right. And it's important to remember that other things play a role in domain restrictions too. Ellipsis, implicature, all sorts of stuff. It's a complex picture.
For sure. Now, this whole discussion about situations and how they work raises a really interesting question. How do situations actually enter into our semantic interpretation? Are they like hidden variables in the syntax of our sentences, or are they more like background parameters?
That's a great question. And it actually mirrors a debate in philosophy of logic about times and possible worlds in modal and tense logic. Think of Kripke's semantics for modal logic, or Pryor's work on tense logic initially. Quantifying over worlds and times was something we did in the meta language, the language we use to talk about the logic, not in the object language itself. Montague, who was super influential in formal semantics, followed this approach. He treated tense and modal operators as shifting the indices of evaluation, rather than binding variables in the sentences.
So instead of saying there exists a possible world where we just shift to that world and evaluate things there.
Exactly. The idea was that once you shifted the index, the original world or time wasn't accessible anymore for evaluation. And this seemed to capture certain limitations on how we can refer back to times and worlds later in a discourse.
Right, so you can't just jump back and forth between worlds willy-nilly.
Exactly. But then along came work on temporal and modal anaphora that challenged this view. People started arguing that natural language actually has the power to quantify over worlds and times directly, just like we quantify over individuals.
So maybe situations work the same way.
Exactly. Cresswell provided some compelling examples for worlds and times, and we can construct analogous examples for situations. Consider this counterfactual. If, whenever it had snowed a lot more than it actually did, the town plow would have cleared the snow for us. To understand this, we need to consider each actual snowfall. Imagine a counterfactual situation where it snowed more, and then relate that back to the situation where the plow does its job. This kind of back and forth between situations seems to require a way to keep track of them, either with a super complicated system of indices or by having situation variables right in the language itself.
So situations are more than just background context. They're part of the language's structure.
That's the argument. And as we get to more complex examples, the idea of using indices gets pretty unwieldy. Imagine this. Whenever it snowed, some local person dreamed that it snowed even more, and the Weather Channel erroneously reported that it had snowed less, but still more than it did in reality. We're juggling different perspectives, different snowfalls. It seems more plausible that language uses situation variables, even if they're not always pronounced, than this complex index system.
Okay, so situations are deeply embedded in how we use language. Now let's move on to those donkey sentences. You know those classic examples like, whenever a donkey appeared, it was greeted. How does situation semantics tackle those?
Situation semantics offers a very elegant approach. The idea is that those adverbs of quantification, like whenever, are quantifying over minimal situations that satisfy the conditions in the first part of the sentence.
So in whenever a donkey appeared, we're considering all the minimal situations where a donkey shows up.
Exactly, and these would typically be situations with just a single donkey.
Okay. And then the it in it was greeted refers back to that donkey.
You got it. The idea is that all those minimal situations with a donkey are part of bigger situations where that donkey is then greeted.
That's pretty neat. But you mentioned earlier that this minimality idea runs into some problems.
It does. For example, what about a sentence like, when snow falls around here, it takes 10 volunteers to remove it? Are there minimal situations of snow falling? It doesn't seem like that captures the meaning we want.
Right, it's not about a single snowflake falling.
Exactly. Right. And what about sentences with negative quantifiers, like, whenever nobody showed up, we canceled the class? What would a minimal situation of nobody showing up even look like?
Yeah, that's weird.
Right. And things get even trickier with quantifiers like more than one or between 20 and 2,000. So simple minimality isn't enough. We need a more nuanced way to connect the first part of the sentence to the situations we're quantifying over.
So what's the solution?
Enter exemplification. This is a really important concept in situation semantics.
Okay, exemplification. Let's hear it.
So in possibilistic situation semantics, a situation is said to exemplify a proposition if either the proposition is true in all of its parts or if the situation is a minimal situation where the proposition is true.
Can you give me an example? I'm a bit lost.
Sure. Let's take the proposition, there is mud. A situation that's just mud and all its parts would exemplify this proposition.
Okay.
But a situation with both mud and moss wouldn't exemplify it. That's because there are parts of that situation, the moss parts, where the proposition isn't true.
Right, so we're filtering out the irrelevant stuff.
Exactly. And this idea of exemplification helps us with those tricky donkey sentences. The idea is that we're quantifying over situations that exemplify the proposition in the first part of the sentence. So whenever a man saw a donkey, the proposition a man saw a donkey is exemplified by situations with one man and one donkey seeing each other.
Ah, okay. And what about those cases like when snow falls?
For those, we need a more sophisticated notion of minimality within exemplification. We might need to consider things like maximal self-connected situations.
Maximal self-connected.
It means we look for a complete contiguous event, like a whole snowfall event, rather than every individual snowflake falling. And for things like a cat eats more than one can of soup or supper, we might need to build in a maximalization condition referring to the total amount eaten.
So we're being flexible with what counts as minimal, depending on the situation.
Exactly. And it turns out that once we do that, quantifying over minimal exemplifying situations often lines up with our intuitions about these complex sentences.
Very cool. So exemplification helps us with those pesky donkey sentences. And you said it also pops up in how we understand questions, right?
It does. It's amazing how this one concept can do so much work. Think about a question like, who caught anything? And the answer, Jason and Willie did.
Yeah.
We usually understand that to mean they were the only ones who caught anything.
Right. That's called an exhaustive interpretation, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. And situation semantics, combined with Grunendijk and Stokhoff's work on questions, can explain this. Well, They analyze the meaning of a question as a proposition that describes all the situations where the answer is the same as the actual answer in the real world.
Okay.
And we can apply exemplification to this question extension. The actual situations that exemplify it become our topic situations. And when we interpret an answer exhaustively, we understand it as also being exemplified by those topic situations.
So, in our example, the topic situations would be those where only Jason and Willie caught something, and Jason and Willie did is understood as being true in only those situations, implying they were the only ones.
Precisely. If we meant it non-exhaustively, we'd say something like, Jason and Willie did, for sure, leaving open the possibility that others did too. And this same idea works for answers like, two cats did, or even nobody did. It's the same principle of exemplification at work, both in donkey sentences and in exhaustive interpretations of questions.
Wow, that's a really powerful connection. So finally, let's talk about the relationship between situation semantics and Davidsonian event semantics. It seems like they're both trying to do something similar.
They are. At their core, both frameworks want to move beyond simple subject-predicate analysis and incorporate more fine-grained entities into our semantic representations, whether those are situations or events. And as we touched upon earlier, there was some debate about whether both frameworks are really necessary.
What's the key difference between them?
A big difference is that in Davidsonian semantics, verb predications often have a built-in minimality condition. For example, Ewan swam means there's a swimming event by Ewan, and that event is just a swim, not a swim plus a bunch of other stuff. But situation semantics doesn't have this minimality baked in.
So if we just say in situation semantics that there's a situation where Ewan is swimming, that situation could include him doing other things too.
Exactly. And that's why a direct translation between the frameworks wouldn't work for a sentence like Ewan swam for 10 hours. In Davidsonian semantics, there's a single swimming event that lasted 10 hours. But in situation semantics, without that minimality, the 10-hour situation could just be a larger context where a short swim occurred.
Right, so we need a way to capture that minimality if we want to bring Davidsonian ideas into situation semantics.
Exactly. And the proposal is that we can do that using exemplification. We can define a Davidsonian event predication as a situation that exemplifies a certain proposition. So E is a swim by Ewan would become E is a situation that exemplifies Ewan swims.
So we're using exemplification to ensure that the situation is just about the swimming event.
You got it. And this allows us to apply the power of exemplification, which we've already seen is useful for other things, to capture that Davidsonian minimality.
That's a really neat solution. It sounds like there's a lot of potential for combining these two frameworks.
Definitely. And there's ongoing research exploring exactly that.
This has been an incredible deep dive into situation semantics. We've covered so much ground, its philosophical origins, those core concepts like infons and topic situations, and its applications to a wide range of linguistic phenomena. It really highlights how powerful this idea of a situation, this partial, contextually relevant aspect of reality, can be for understanding meaning in natural language.
And the concept of exemplification has emerged as a key player, showing up in everything from donkey sentences to exhaustive interpretations of questions, and even offering a potential bridge to Davidsonian semantics.
It's given us a lot to think about. And for you, our listener, who I know loves a good philosophical puzzle, here's a final thought. How does this idea of partial situations connect to other philosophical concepts you're familiar with? Could it shed new light on things like incomplete knowledge, the importance of perspective, or even the nature of facts themselves?
It's definitely worth pondering how thinking in terms of situations might change our approach to some of these big questions.
Absolutely, and that's what philosophy is all about, isn't it? So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into situation semantics. We hope it's been a valuable journey.
And we encourage you to explore these ideas further. There's so much more to discover.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.